From Sean Strickland mocking his fight against Nate Diaz, to Ben Askren taunting Nate's fans to brace themselves. The UFC world has a lot to say about the upcoming Diaz versus Paul fight. And here's how they reacted, starting with Sean Strickland calling the whole fight a joke. Now, the former king of the cage spoke for a lot of people in the UFC world when he tweeted about the upcoming fight between veteran Nate Diaz and YouTuber turned boxer Jake Paul. As soon as the news about the match was announced, the fighter took to Twitter to express how he felt about the whole thing. He started this tweet in a very aggressive tone, calling the match between the two an effing joke. He then pointed out everything that made him mad about the fight. And honestly, he does have some pretty solid points. Sean called the fight a clown show and said that he wasn't impressed that both the fighters were going to make a lot of money from this match. But he was mad about everything else. He said that he was mad how Diaz, a retired 155er, was going to be fighting a juiced TikToker at 185 pounds. He also called out Jake Paul, talking about how he's just a TikToker who couldn't even win against Tommy Fury.
He's trying to knock out Fury with the heavier shots, but there's no real structure behind it. He's got to use his jab a little bit more.
When talking about Paul's first defeat of his career back in Saudi, but he didn't stop there. He also called Tommy Fury a recreational boxer too. Guess he was on a roll. But so was this next fighter, who's just not getting all the hype around the fight.
To an armbar, Nate's got it.
Gonna try to submit him right here.
Gomi is in all sorts of trouble here, and he will switch to a...
Matt Brown wasn't excited one bit. Now, there's been a lot of hype building up to the fight, even before it had been officially announced. A lot of people have been begging the UFC to make this fight happen. So now that it has been announced, it seems to be the only thing anyone seems to be interested in talking about.
Diaz with a lot of pressure. Pettis caught him though with the right hand there.
But with a lot of fighters giving their predictions for the fight and talking about it, Matt Brown seems to not be getting any of the hype around this upcoming fight. Right after the fight was announced by the UFC, Brown took to Twitter to talk about how unexcited he was about the whole thing. He started his tweet by asking followers what they thought about it, and then said that he admits that it might be cool or whatever, but it doesn't really deserve all this hype for a lot of reasons. He also said that he hopes that Nate at least gets a good payday out of it, before once again saying that this fight and the news doesn't really excite him at all. He said the only way he could have been made excited about the fight was if they did it with the complete Muay Thai rules, and that this was also the only way to get him to fight someone like Jake Paul.
Kind of a flashback moment for Woodley. Tried to land the uppercut, and then he just kind of did a takedown of Jake.
I mean, not sure if this was mildly insulting to Nate for fighting Jake, or to Jake for just being Jake. But this next fighter made sure to call them both out. Dylan Dennis. While Matt Brown might have done it in a way that called for speculation, Dylan Dennis made sure to make it very clear how strongly he felt about both fighters.
Shields, Richard Perez and company. Again, Diaz connects. Connor comes back.
And honestly, a lot of people agreed with him when he said what he said. Upon hearing the news about the upcoming fight between Diaz and Paul, he also hopped online and spilled his feelings about it. He started his tweet by bringing out Jake's first ever defeat of his career to Tommy Fury last year. Dennis said that Jake lost to one of the only pro boxers that were his age and weight class. But he also called Tommy out too, sarcastically calling him a pro and saying that he's actually terrible.
All kinds of rumors have been doing the rounds today. Someone said they'd unearthed the script to the way that the fight's going to go.
But then he also decided to come for Nate Diaz and said that Jake Paul, after losing to Fury, has now turned to Nate Diaz, calling him a retired, smaller MMA fighter. I mean, he does have a point, and a lot of people do agree with him, but he didn't have to go all the way to not only insult one, but all three fighters that were involved. Like, the fighter wasn't pressed about the fight.
Transitions to the armbar.
He just found it funny, adding a good handful of laughing emojis in the front of his tweet. Now sure, Dennis didn't pick a side, but do you know who did? Paul Redmond. Paul decided to call the whole fan base out for the way they had been reacting to the news. Brown might agree with Redmond on this one, like many others on the list. He also took his frustrations to the Bird app after the news broke out to talk about how he felt about the fight. He started his tweet and talked about how Tommy Fury absolutely destroyed Jake Paul in their fight last year, and comparing him to Nate, his new opponent. He said that Nate has been destroying real boxers for at least 15 years, and then talked about how strong Nate actually is.
You hear Jim's corner yelling out, 30 seconds, Jim, 30 seconds. They just want him to survive.
Saying he has a granite chin and how he could do cardio for days on end. So he implied that there's no comparison between Nate Diaz and Jake Paul. One is an actual fierce boxer, and the other's just a YouTuber who came into the game and lost to a boxer who wasn't even that strong.
That was the punch you were talking about, whether he was on unsteady legs there. Fletch, it's a long sort of...
He then said he didn't really understand why people were rooting for Jake Paul and saying that it was going to be an easy win for him. Honestly, that's one thing most of you would agree with. No matter who you're supporting, you have to agree that this is not going to be easy for Jake. Am I missing something? He said at the end of his tweet. Well, he might be missing out on something, but I'm gonna make sure y'all don't miss out on what the UFC world had to say about this fight. Because you see, it seems like every pro out there's got something to say about it. And the fact that both of them have a huge fan base all across the world only helps with the hype. Among many other pro fighters, Sean O'Malley was another one who decided to share his thoughts on the match. He took to Twitter and made sure people knew he was excited about the news. OMG, Diaz versus Paul, he started his tweet. He talked about how excited he was about the match and said that he's super hyped to see what the results of the fight will be. I think a lot of fighters I talked about, including Brown, would disagree with him on this. But even if you're not that excited about the fight, you'll have to agree with Terrence McKinney on what he said. He said that he couldn't wait for the press conferences before and after the fight, all because he was excited about the trash talking both the fighters were going to do for each other. And honestly, that does sound very exciting. After all, what's the UFC without a few verbal jabs in between? As far as the trash talking is concerned, then why wait for Diaz to trash talk Paul when Carl Forch is doing it before the fight has ever happened? He took to Twitter and tagged Jake Paul in his tweet, where he asked people if Paul was even a real fighter, followed by a bunch of laughing face emojis. Ben Askren also made sure to make it clear which side he was on. He tweeted saying that Nate Diaz fans will be crying a lot after Jake Paul beats him, which is a pretty huge thing to say if I'm being honest. Having said that, that was all about how the UFC world reacted to Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul.